In the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler pointed at a map and made a promise. Not to take a city, to erase it. A city that carried his rival's name. Joseph Stalin's city. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a slow, grinding execution of two armies, fought street by street, room by room, until either side remembered what victory was supposed to look like. By the time the guns fell silent, nearly 2 million people would be dead, wounded, or missing. And the war, the entire war, would never be the same again. By mid-1942, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had stalled. Moscow hadn't fallen. Leningrad was under siege but not broken. So the German High Command shifted the plans south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Stalingrad wasn't the real prize. It was a shield, a city on the Volga River that could protect the flank of the advance and choke off Soviet supply lines. But Hitler became fixated. The city bore Stalin's name, and for the Führer, that made it personal. Taking it wasn't just strategy anymore, it was propaganda, a symbol he couldn't resist. For Stalin, the calculation was just as absolute. The Volga was the last major barrier before the Soviet interior. If Stalingrad fell, the road east lay open. Both dictators drew the same line in the sand, for different reasons, and neither was willing to move it. On August 23, 1942, the German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, closed in. That same day, the Luftwaffe launched one of the most devastating bombing raids of the entire war on the city below. The bombing killed tens of thousands in a single day and turned Stalingrad into a landscape of rubble. And that, unexpectedly, became a Soviet advantage. German tanks were built for open plains, for speed and maneuver, not for climbing over collapsed buildings and burned-out streets. Soviet General Vasily Chukov, commanding the 62nd Army, made a brutal calculation: fight as close to the Germans as physically possible. He called it hugging the enemy, staying so close that German artillery and air support couldn't be used without hitting their own men. The result was a new kind of warfare. Soldiers called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Fighting for a single staircase could take days. A building might change hands a dozen times in an afternoon. One apartment block, defended by a small Soviet detachment under Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, held out for nearly 2 months against repeated German assaults. German soldiers began marking territory not in miles, but in rooms. This wasn't the blitzkrieg that had conquered Poland and France in weeks. This was something slower, and far more costly, a war of attrition where the only currency was human life. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army had captured most of Stalingrad, but most wasn't enough. Soviet defenders still clung to a thin strip along the Volga's western bank, and every attempt to push them into the river failed. What Paulus didn't know was that while his men bled for every ruined building, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov was building something far larger in complete secrecy. The flanks north and south of Stalingrad weren't held by elite German troops. They were held by Romanian and Italian divisions, poorly equipped and thinly stretched. Zhukov had found the weak point. On November 19, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops smashed through the Romanian lines to the north. A day later, they broke through in the south. 4 days after that, the two Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalik, sealing the trap. Nearly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers, the entire Sixth Army, were suddenly surrounded. Paulus requested permission to break out while there was still a corridor open. Hitler's answer was one word: no. The city he had promised to erase had instead become his own army's grave. Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to hold its position, promising an air bridge to keep them supplied and a relief force to break the siege from outside. Neither promise held. The Luftwaffe could deliver only a fraction of the food, fuel, and ammunition the trapped army needed. Temperatures dropped to nearly -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, many still in summer uniforms, began dying not just from Soviet bullets, but from frostbite, starvation, and typhus. In December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, and attempt to punch a corridor through to the trapped Sixth Army. His forces came within roughly 48 kilometers of the pocket, close enough that trapped soldiers could reportedly see flares on the horizon. Paulus, bound by Hitler's direct order, refused to attempt a breakout to meet them. Soviet reinforcements pushed Manstein's relief force back. The last real chance to save the Sixth Army was gone. What remained inside the pocket was no longer an army. It was a dying city within a dying siege, waiting for an ending that everyone but Hitler already understood. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was starving, out of ammunition, and split into two pockets. On January 30th, in a final act of theater, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered, and the promotion was a clear message: die, or become the first. Paulus surrendered the next day anyway. Of roughly 91,000 German soldiers taken prisoner at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest died in Soviet captivity from disease, starvation, and forced labor in the years that followed. Total losses on both sides, killed, wounded, captured, and missing, are estimated at nearly 2 million people. For context, that's more casualties than the United States suffered in the entirety of World War II, in a single battle. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility that had held since 1939. It was the first time an entire German field army had been destroyed, and Hitler never fully recovered strategic initiative on the Eastern Front again. From here, the war in the East would be a slow, brutal retreat, through Kursk, through Ukraine, through Poland, all the way back to Berlin. Historians still debate exactly when the tide of the Second World War turned. Some point to Midway. Some point to El Alamein. But for the war's largest and bloodiest theater, the Eastern Front, where roughly 80% of all German military casualties occurred, Stalingrad is the line in the sand. Before it, the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. After it, every German soldier, every general, and Hitler himself knew the war could be lost. It wasn't won with brilliant maneuvers or overwhelming technology. It was won street by street, room by room, by soldiers on both sides who simply refused to yield ground that, by any rational measure, wasn't worth the cost. That's the terrible arithmetic of Stalingrad, a battle where the city itself was almost beside the point, and the real prize was proving which side would break first. If this kind of history, the moments that quietly decided everything, is what you're here for, subscribe, because there are many more turning points still to uncover.